Mike Johnson had been a mechanic for over 20 years. He ran a small, dusty auto repair shop on the outskirts of a sleepy town. The kind of town where nothing exciting ever happened, and Mike was okay with that. It was quiet, peaceful, and gave him plenty of time to tinker with old cars. Most days, his shop had the smell of oil and grease in the air, mixed with the sounds of clanking wrenches and the hum of car engines. It was a simple life, and he liked it that way. That night, however, was different. Mike was sitting in his office, sipping on a cup of coffee and flipping through an old car magazine, when the sound of a vehicle's tires crunching on the gravel outside caught his attention. He looked up from his magazine, surprised. It was almost midnight, and Mike wasn't expecting anyone. The townspeople all knew his shop closed by 6 p.m., so whoever this was, they were either in urgent need of help or completely lost. The vehicle stopped in front of his garage, and the headlights blinked off. Mike could barely make out the shape of the car, a strange one at that, through the dusty window. It didn't look like anything he had ever worked on. The headlights were too bright, and the body of the vehicle seemed too smooth, almost shiny, even in the dark. Mike raised an eyebrow. That wasn't a normal car. He grabbed his flashlight and headed outside to take a look. As he approached the vehicle, 2 figures stepped out. They looked like normal people at first, but as they came closer, Mike noticed something unusual. They were tall, taller than the average human, and they had pale skin that seemed almost too smooth, like it had never been touched by the sun. Their hair was white, almost silver, and they both wore strange silver-colored outfits that looked more like something out of a science fiction movie than real life. "Can I help you folks?" Mike asked, trying to sound casual despite feeling a little nervous. After all, who in their right mind would show up at a mechanic's shop in the middle of nowhere at midnight? The man, or what Mike assumed was a man, stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost too calm, like he was used to people being intimidated by him. "We need help. Our vehicle has malfunctioned, and we are stranded." Mike's eyebrow arched even higher. What kind of vehicle are we talking about? He glanced over his shoulder at the strange machine that had brought them here. The woman beside the man spoke up this time. Her voice was soft but firm. "It's not like anything you have seen before, but it runs on similar systems to your Earth vehicles. We just need assistance in fixing it." Mike rubbed his chin thoughtfully. This wasn't a typical call for roadside assistance. Still, curiosity was getting the best of him. He was a mechanic, after all, and there was no harm in taking a look, right? He wasn't the type to turn down a challenge. "All right, well, show me what's wrong," he said. "I'll take a look, but I'm not promising I can fix it. I've worked on everything from old junkers to fancy sports cars, but I've never seen anything like this." The 2 strangers didn't seem fazed by his skepticism. They simply nodded and gestured toward the vehicle. Mike followed them around the back of the machine, and his jaw nearly dropped. The vehicle wasn't a car at all. It looked more like a smooth metallic craft, almost like a flying saucer, but it was about the size of a small van. The surface of the craft shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting a soft, pale glow. Mike could see that it had no wheels or tires. Instead, there were strange, glowing symbols along the sides, pulsating softly like a heartbeat. There was no exhaust pipe, no engine visible from the outside, just a smooth, shiny surface and those weird glowing patterns. "This is something else," Mike muttered under his breath. "You guys are telling me this is your car?" The woman smiled faintly. "It is our transportation. It is broken, and we require your assistance to repair it." Mike stared at the craft for a moment, still unsure of what to think. Could this be some kind of elaborate prank? Were they just wearing costumes and trying to mess with him? He glanced at their serious faces, then back at the craft. They didn't look like they were joking. "I've worked on all kinds of engines and machinery," Mike said, shaking his head. "But this is beyond anything I've seen." The man spoke again, his tone becoming more urgent. "We don't have much time. We are on a diplomatic mission, and we were forced to land when our propulsion system malfunctioned. Our people will not be able to reach us for several days, and we need to repair our vessel before that time expires." Mike scratched his head, trying to process what he was hearing. A diplomatic mission. From somewhere. He had to admit he was curious. But even if these people were telling the truth, he had no idea how to fix a vehicle like this. Not with his limited knowledge of Earth machines, let alone alien technology. All right, Mike said, trying to focus. "Let's take a closer look. But I need to warn you, I might not be able to do much. I'm just a regular mechanic, not a scientist or anything." The woman nodded, her expression calm, but still filled with a sense of urgency. "We understand. We only ask that you try. If we cannot repair this vehicle, we will be stranded here for far longer than we anticipated." Mike sighed, walking around the craft. He noticed a small hatch on the side and pushed it open. Inside, the craft was dimly lit, with strange, sleek panels that looked almost too advanced to be real. There were no visible seats, no steering wheel, nothing that looked even remotely familiar to a traditional vehicle. The twins, or whatever they were, moved inside with ease, pointing to various parts of the interior. "The propulsion system is damaged," the man explained, showing Mike a series of crystalline structures that appeared to be the heart of the machine. "If you can fix these, the rest will follow." Mike had no idea what he was looking at. These crystals were glowing faintly, much like the symbols on the outside of the craft. They seemed to be the source of energy, but they were shattered in places, their smooth surfaces cracked and chipped. "Okay, let me see what I can do," Mike said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I'm going to need some tools. Do you have anything I can use?" The twins nodded and handed him a strange-looking device that looked a bit like a cross between a wrench and a laser pointer. Mike took it reluctantly, inspecting it closely. It wasn't anything like the tools he had in his shop, but it seemed to work in a similar way. He gave the craft a few experimental taps with the tool, and to his surprise, a small panel on the side opened up, revealing more parts he didn't recognize. "All right," Mike muttered. "This is gonna be one heck of a fix. But I got some tools back at my shop. I'll go grab 'em and be back in a few." As he walked back to his garage, his mind raced. Was he really about to try and repair an alien spacecraft? Was he crazy? He couldn't help but think this was all some strange dream. But at the same time, his curiosity and the thrill of the challenge kept him going. Little did Mike know, this was just the beginning of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Mike was back in his workshop, pacing back and forth. The cool desert night air felt refreshing against his skin, but his mind was racing. Just a few minutes ago, he was fixing old cars for a living. And now, well, now he was staring down what looked like an alien spacecraft. The twins, their strange appearance still stuck in Mike's mind, had led him to the machine, and they were counting on him to fix it. Mike wasn't sure if he was dreaming or if he had completely lost his mind. The alien device they had handed him earlier, which looked like some kind of high-tech multi-tool, was now sitting on his workbench. He inspected it under the fluorescent lights of his garage. It didn't feel like any tool he had ever used. It was smooth and lightweight, but it hummed with a faint, almost musical sound. Mike couldn't help but think that if this was a joke, it was the strangest one he had ever heard. But there was no turning back. He had agreed to help, and as crazy as it sounded, Mike was a man who never backed down from a challenge. The idea of fixing alien technology thrilled him, even if it seemed impossible. He wasn't a scientist or an engineer. He was just a regular mechanic. But he had worked on hundreds of different machines over the years. And maybe, just maybe, he could figure this out. Mike grabbed his toolbox and headed back to the spot where the strange craft was parked. The twins were waiting for him, standing next to the shiny, glowing ship. As he walked closer, they greeted him with their usual calm, almost otherworldly demeanor. "We appreciate you returning so quickly, Mike," the man said in his soft voice. "It is a pleasure to meet a being who is willing to help us." Mike stopped in front of the craft, eyeing it curiously. "I don't know if I'd call it a pleasure, but I guess it's one way to spend an evening," he said, trying to make light of the situation. He didn't want to seem too nervous, even if his heart was still racing. The woman twin stepped forward and pointed to a section of the ship. "This is where the damage is most severe. We need your expertise to restore the propulsion system." She had an intensity in her eyes that suggested she wasn't just asking for a favor, she was depending on him. Mike wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. "All right, show me what I'm dealing with." Inside the ship, Mike felt like he had stepped into a completely different world. The walls weren't made of metal like the cars he worked on. They were smooth, almost liquid-like. There were no buttons or levers, just soft, glowing panels that pulsed with light. The more he looked around, the more he realized how advanced the technology was. It didn't look anything like the complex gadgets he had seen on Earth. There were no wires, no gears. Everything was so sleek. The twins explained the inner workings of their spacecraft, but Mike found it hard to understand. They didn't speak the same language he was used to, but somehow he could sense what they meant through their calm, clear gestures and the occasional touch of their hands. It was as if they were communicating with their minds more than their mouths. "We use energy crystals for power," the man said, pointing to several large, glowing gemstones embedded in the walls of the ship. "These crystals are the heart of the ship. They supply power to every system, including the propulsion mechanism. When one of them cracks or becomes damaged, the entire system begins to fail." Mike frowned. "These crystals, what exactly are they made of? How do they work?" The woman stepped closer and explained. "They are not like the minerals found on your planet. These crystals are created by our people, using energy from the stars. They have the ability to store immense amounts of power, but they are also very delicate. A small crack can cause a cascade of failures throughout the system." Mike nodded, trying to wrap his head around what they were saying. "So, if these things are so important, we need to figure out how to fix them, right?" "Correct," the man replied. He looked at the cracks in the crystals. They were small but deep, almost like a fracture in glass. Mike had no idea how to fix something like this. He had never seen anything remotely similar in his years as a mechanic, but that didn't stop him from trying. "Let's start with the basics," Mike said, more to himself than anyone else. He knelt down beside the damaged crystals, inspecting them closely. He was used to working with engines, fuel systems, and electronics, but this was completely different. There was no engine here, no gas tank, just smooth, glowing stones that were somehow powering this incredible craft. One of the twins handed him the strange device again, and this time, Mike took it with a new sense of determination. It had buttons, yes, but none of them seemed to be for simple tasks like tightening bolts or loosening screws. Instead, the device seemed to respond to his touch, almost as if it could sense what he wanted to do. Mike pressed a button, and to his surprise, the tool emitted a soft glow. It started to vibrate, and in that moment, Mike realized something. This wasn't just a regular tool. It was somehow interacting with the crystals. He aimed it at one of the cracks in the damaged crystal and watched as the tool's light shifted to match the color of the crack. The glow from the tool seemed to flow into the crystal, gently filling the crack, like liquid filling the gaps in a broken vase. The twins were watching him closely, their eyes wide with anticipation. "What are you doing?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike didn't answer immediately. He was too focused. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think I'm repairing it." He felt the tool pulse again, and the crack in the crystal seemed to shrink before his eyes. It was working, slowly, but it was working. Mike didn't stop. He kept the tool focused on the cracks, moving it slowly over the damaged areas. With each pulse, the cracks grew smaller and smaller, until, eventually, they disappeared entirely. It was like magic, but Mike knew better than to call it that. This was some kind of science, just one that was far beyond anything he had ever seen. "That's incredible," the man said, stepping forward. "You are restoring the crystal's energy flow." Mike wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I guess I am," he said, almost in disbelief. He had no idea how the tool was working, but it didn't matter. It was working, and that was all that counted right now. As Mike continued to repair the crystals, the woman twin began explaining more about their technology. "We use this energy to power not only our ships, but also to communicate across vast distances. Our people are spread across many worlds, and this energy allows us to stay connected." Mike listened carefully, fascinated by what he was hearing. They didn't just have spaceships. They had technology that allowed them to communicate across the stars. It made Mike's head spin. How could humanity possibly compete with something like this? "The crystals are not just power sources," the man continued. "They are living entities in a way. They are created by the energy of the stars, and their structure can be reshaped, but only by those who understand their nature. You seem to have a gift for this." Mike wasn't sure about the gift part, but he was starting to understand something about their technology. It wasn't just about brute force or mechanical work. It was about finesse, about understanding the delicate balance of energy and matter. Mike had always been good with his hands, but this was a whole new level of problem solving. Maybe he wasn't just fixing cars anymore. Maybe he was unlocking the mysteries of the universe. After what felt like hours, the cracks in the crystals were finally gone. Mike stepped back, exhausted but proud of the work he had done. The ship hummed softly, its energy levels returning to normal. The twins looked at each other, then back at Mike. "You have done something extraordinary," the woman said. "We are grateful." Mike shrugged, trying to act modest. "I'm just doing what I can." The man smiled, his eyes gleaming with appreciation. "You are not like the others of your kind. You have a unique understanding of machines, even ones beyond your world. This is why we sought your help." Mike looked at the glowing crystals one last time, then up at the sleek spacecraft. He had just repaired an alien spaceship. It didn't feel real, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to be the same after this. Whatever came next, Mike Johnson, auto mechanic, was about to be part of something much bigger than anything he had ever imagined. Mike wiped his hands on a rag, stepping back from the glowing ship. The crack in the crystal was gone, and the engine hummed back to life. The faint, blue light that filled the inside of the craft had returned, and the panels that had been dead for hours now flickered with energy. Mike couldn't believe it. He had actually done it. He had helped fix an alien spaceship. The twins, tall, pale, and always calm, stood beside him, watching as the craft slowly powered up. Mike still wasn't sure what to make of them, but the work he had done seemed to earn their respect. They had already told him he was different from anyone they had met on Earth, that he had an understanding of machines that they hadn't expected. As weird as it all sounded, Mike couldn't help but feel proud. "Mike," the man said, his voice as calm as ever, but there was a certain tension in his words. "We must leave quickly. Our people will notice our absence soon, and we cannot afford to be here when they arrive." Mike blinked, still catching his breath from the repair work. "What do you mean, your people?" he asked, still trying to piece it all together. "I thought you were on a diplomatic mission. Are you saying someone's coming after you?" The woman twin stepped closer, her pale face serious. "Yes," she replied quietly. "We are not the only ones of our kind who travel through the stars. Some of our people are not as friendly as we are. If they find us stranded here, they will not hesitate to take action." Mike didn't need to ask any more questions. He could tell by the look in their eyes that they weren't just being cautious. They were scared. And that fear made Mike uneasy. He wasn't a hero, just a regular guy who fixed cars. But standing there in the glow of their spacecraft, Mike knew that whatever happened next, he had to help them. The woman nodded toward the craft. We need to get to a safer location. Your assistance has helped us immensely, but now we must move quickly. Please, join us." Mike hesitated for only a moment. He didn't know exactly what he was getting into, but one thing was clear: he couldn't just walk away now. The twins had trusted him, and somehow he had come to trust them. He followed them toward the ship, ready for whatever came next. Once inside, the door sealed behind them, and the craft slowly began to rise. The familiar hum of the engine filled the air as the ship lifted off the ground, sending a jolt of excitement through Mike. As it gained altitude, Mike glanced out the window, watching the desert landscape shrink below them. "This is incredible," Mike muttered, eyes wide as he looked out at the endless expanse of the night sky. "I'm in a spaceship." The man-twin, who had introduced himself as Azar, nodded, but his expression remained serious. "You are not far from the truth, Mike, but our time here is limited." Mike turned his attention back to the inside of the ship. The panels that lined the walls were now fully illuminated, the soft glow of blue and green lights casting an eerie but beautiful effect. The ship felt alive, like it was breathing, or perhaps responding to their presence. But before Mike could take in more of the surroundings, Azar spoke again. "We need to make a quick detour. There are others who might be looking for us." Mike's stomach tightened. He didn't know who the others were, but he could tell that Azar wasn't just talking about a couple of people. The fear in his voice was unmistakable. Suddenly, a loud buzzing noise interrupted their conversation. The ship's alarms blared to life, flashing red lights on the walls. Mike's heart raced. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The woman twin, whose name was Ilara, moved swiftly to one of the glowing panels on the wall. Her fingers danced across the surface, and the ship responded with a series of beeps. "They are here," she said quietly, her face grim. "Our enemies have tracked us down." Mike's blood ran cold. "Enemies? What do you mean? Who's after you?" Azar turned to him, his expression hardening. "We are not the only ones from our kind who travel the stars, Mike. There are those who do not share our peaceful intentions. They believe in using force to control and dominate, not diplomacy." Mike felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just some high-tech rescue mission. These people, these aliens, had enemies, enemies who would stop at nothing to capture them. Ilara's fingers continued to tap rapidly across the glowing panel. "I'm engaging the cloaking device. It should hide us from their sensors. But we don't have much time." The ship began to shimmer, and for a brief moment, Mike thought he was imagining it. The craft's outline blurred and became translucent, almost as if it was disappearing right in front of him. "It's working," Azar said, his voice tinged with relief. "We should be hidden for now." But just as Mike thought they might be safe, a loud thud echoed through the hull of the ship, followed by another. Then a third. The craft shuddered violently, throwing Mike off balance. He reached out to grab a railing as the ship rocked. "We've been hit," Ilara shouted. "They're firing at us." Before Mike could process what was happening, another violent jolt slammed through the ship, and the sound of screeching metal filled the air. The lights flickered and dimmed, and the craft's smooth hum shifted to a harsh growl. It felt like the ship was fighting to stay in the air. Mike's heart raced. He had no idea what kind of weapons were out there, but he could feel the pressure building. This was no longer just a simple repair job. It was a fight for survival. "Hang on," Azar shouted. "We need to outrun them. Ilara, engage the emergency thrusters." Ilara nodded and punched a few commands into the panel. The ship jerked forward, the force slamming Mike into his seat. The sound of roaring engines filled the cabin, and the ship shot forward with terrifying speed. "Hold on," Ilara cried as she worked frantically to keep the ship on course. "I'm engaging evasive maneuvers." The ship veered left, then right, twisting and turning as it dodged more shots from what Mike could only guess were enemy ships. The craft's sleek exterior shimmered in the night sky, but Mike knew it wasn't enough to keep them safe forever. He could hear the distant hum of engines closing in, getting louder with each passing second. "We need to get out of here," Mike shouted. "Do you have a plan?" Azar turned to him, his face set with determination. "We need to reach the safe zone. It's a location hidden from their sensors. We can't let them track us." But just as he finished speaking, another loud boom rang through the ship. The craft lurched violently, throwing Mike out of his seat. He hit the floor hard. The wind knocked out of him. The ship's alarms screamed, and the lights flickered out completely. For a moment, everything was chaos. Voices shouting, alarms blaring, the craft shuddering violently as it tried to stay in the air. Mike struggled to his feet, his head spinning. He didn't know what to do. All he could do was hold on and trust that Azar and Ilara knew what they were doing. Azar, gripping a railing, turned to Mike. "Prepare yourself. This will get worse before it gets better. We have one shot at this." Mike's heart raced. What did he mean by that? What were they going to do? Just then, the ship gave another violent shake, and the sound of an explosion ripped through the air. Mike's eyes widened as he realized they were running out of time. The ship shuddered again, throwing Mike off balance. His body slammed against the side of the craft, his heart pounding in his chest. The noise of explosions, blaring alarms, and the roaring of enemy ships outside made it feel like the walls of the spaceship were closing in on him. It was chaos. Mike scrambled to his feet, his head spinning. He was in a fight for survival now, but he had no idea what to do. All he had was his gut instinct, and that, along with the skills he learned fixing cars and machines for years, was the only thing that could help him now. Azar and Ilara were calm despite the chaos. Azar gripped the control panel, his fingers flying across the glowing interface. Ilara sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the view outside, scanning for any signs of the enemy. "We need to move faster," Ilara shouted over the noise of the ship. "They're closing in on us." Mike's heart skipped a beat. "How much time do we have?" Azar didn't look up, but his voice was firm. "Not long. If we don't outrun them, they'll catch up, and it will be over. We need to reach the safe zone." Mike nodded, though he didn't fully understand what the safe zone was. All he knew was that these enemies, whoever they were, had superior technology. He could hear the enemy ship's engines getting louder and closer, each moment bringing them nearer to their target. The ship's alarms suddenly blared again, the red warning lights flashing as a new set of enemies appeared on the radar. Mike tried to shake off his fear, focusing on what Azar and Ilara were doing. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't a soldier, but if he was going to survive this, he had to help. The ship lurched forward again, and Mike grabbed onto the nearest seat, barely keeping his balance. Azar had just engaged the ship's emergency thrusters, pushing them forward with unbelievable speed. The sound of the enemy ship's weapons firing at them echoed through the hull, each shot shaking the ship with terrifying force. "We're not going to outrun them like this," Ilara said, her voice tight. "We need a diversion." Azar nodded, his face grim. "I'm working on it, but we have to be quick." Mike glanced outside the window, his heart racing. He could see the flashes of enemy ship engines in the distance, their shapes barely visible against the dark sky. They were still too far away to see clearly, but they were gaining ground. Azar's hands moved with lightning speed on the control panel. The ship's movements were getting erratic, jerking left and right as they tried to dodge the incoming attacks. Mike could see the enemy ships closing in. If they didn't act fast, they were done for. "Ilara, activate the cloaking device," Azar commanded. Ilara quickly responded, her fingers dancing across another set of glowing panels. A moment later, the ship shimmered and disappeared, blending into the vast expanse of space. The outside world became a blur, and for a brief moment, Mike felt a sense of hope. They had become invisible to their enemies. But the hope didn't last long. The enemy ships didn't stop. They were still there, searching. The problem was, they didn't have the luxury of time. The cloaking device only worked for so long. "We can't keep hiding like this," Mike said, his voice shaky but determined. "We need to do something." Azar looked up, his face set in concentration. "You're right. We need to make them think we've gone in another direction. Ilara, engage the decoy system." Ilara's hands moved quickly across the console. "Done. The decoys are in place. We'll make it look like there are multiple ships, splitting up to confuse them." Mike watched in awe as a series of bright, blinking lights shot out from the ship, appearing to scatter into several different directions in space. The lights were designed to look like ships to anyone watching on radar, giving the enemies the impression that the craft they were after had split into multiple parts. For a moment, the ship shook again as the enemy ships tried to target the decoys. Mike could hear the thuds and blasts of their weapons, but it seemed like the enemies couldn't figure out which of the ships was real. Mike felt a surge of relief. For a moment, it felt like they might actually pull this off. But just as Mike began to relax, a new alarm blared. The lights on the ship flickered again, and Ilara's face turned pale. "They've locked onto us," she said, her voice full of panic. "The decoys won't work forever." Azar's face turned hard. "We need to jump. Now." Mike didn't fully understand what Azar meant, but he could see that the urgency in his eyes was not something to ignore. Azar turned toward the control panel, his fingers flying over the buttons. The ship began to hum louder, and Mike felt an intense force pushing him back into his seat. "What's happening?" Mike shouted. "We're jumping to hyperspace," Azar explained, his voice steady. "It's our only chance." Mike's eyes widened. Hyperspace, was that even real? He had heard about it in sci-fi movies, but he never thought it was possible. Now, sitting in the cockpit of an alien ship, he was about to experience it for real. The ship began to shake violently, and the sound of a deep, resonating hum filled the air. Mike felt the strange, almost magnetic force pulling him in every direction as the craft sped up faster than he thought was possible. The stars outside the window stretched and warped, their light twisting into long streaks. It was like the universe itself was bending around them. For a brief moment, Mike felt weightless, like he was floating in the middle of nowhere. Then, with a sharp jolt, the ship shot forward with unimaginable speed. Mike's stomach churned. He had never experienced anything like it before. He felt like his body was being stretched in every direction, as though time and space were folding around them. "This is hyperspace," Azar said, his voice calm, though Mike could sense the strain. "We're traveling faster than light. Our enemies won't be able to follow us." Mike held onto the seat tightly, trying not to panic. He had always been a simple mechanic, someone who fixed old cars and trucks. Now he was part of something far beyond anything he had ever imagined. As the ship sped through hyperspace, Mike glanced at Azar and Ilara. Their faces were tense, but they were in control. They had been through this before. They were used to the danger, the fast-paced decisions, the constant fight for survival. Mike, on the other hand, was a rookie at best, but he had to keep it together. They were depending on him. "I don't know if I can handle this," Mike admitted, his voice shaky. Ilara turned to him, a small, reassuring smile on her face. "You're doing well, Mike. We've never had anyone like you helping us before." Mike looked back at her, still stunned. "I never thought I'd be flying through space with aliens, trying to outrun whatever those things were." Azar chuckled, though the tension didn't leave his face. "Welcome to our world, Mike. We're glad to have you with us." As the ship continued to travel through the warped space, Mike couldn't help but wonder what awaited them at the end of this journey. The danger wasn't over. They had only bought themselves some time. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Mike felt a small sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this alive. The ship continued to speed through hyperspace, and Mike sat there, holding on, his mind racing with questions and thoughts. He was far from the mechanic he used to be. Now, he was in the middle of something much bigger, a fight that spanned across the stars. And no matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same again. The ship continued to race through hyperspace, with Mike gripping the seat as if his life depended on it. And in a way it did. The stars outside the ship's windows streaked into long lines of light, stretching as the ship pushed further into the unknown. Mike was no longer just a mechanic from Earth. He was part of something much bigger, caught up in the struggle of two alien twins and their fight for survival. And now, it seemed, he was about to take part in a whole new chapter of this crazy journey: fixing the ship. It had been hours since they made the jump to hyperspace, but Mike could feel the tension in the air. Azar and Ilara, despite being calm on the outside, were both on edge. Every few minutes, Azar would glance at the control panel, his fingers quickly adjusting settings to keep them on course. Ilara sat in front of a set of complicated readings, her expression focused but anxious. "We're still on course," Azar said, his voice calm but firm, though Mike could tell he was exhausted. "We need to make it through another few hours of hyperspace travel before we can safely land and repair the damage." "Damage?" Mike asked, raising an eyebrow. "What damage?" "The ship looks fine from here." Ilara looked up from her console, her expression serious. "We're not out of danger yet, Mike. The enemy ships might have lost us for now, but when we exit hyperspace, we'll be in uncharted territory. We're still running on fumes, and some of the systems on this ship are fragile." Azar nodded. "Our cloaking device took a lot of energy to keep us hidden, and the evasive maneuvers we had to perform caused some strain on the ship's core. We're going to need a lot of repairs before we can continue our journey." Mike swallowed hard. "Okay, but what can I do to help? I'm just a mechanic. I don't know how to fix alien ships." Azar turned to him, his calm eyes locking with Mike's. "You're more capable than you think. You helped us fix the core earlier, remember? This ship, like any other, operates on mechanical principles. Once we land, I'll guide you through the repairs. We'll need your expertise to get everything running again." Mike took a deep breath. He was still unsure about his place in all of this, but the calm determination in Azar's eyes gave him confidence. He was here for a reason. He could do this. Hours passed, and the tension in the ship didn't ease. Mike spent most of the time staring out the windows, wondering what lay ahead. What did the twins mean by uncharted territory? Were there more enemies waiting for them? Or would they finally find a safe place to regroup and plan their next move? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ship began to slow down. The familiar hum of hyperspace faded, and the bright streaks of light outside the windows began to blur, changing back into the soft, twinkling stars of normal space. Azar's voice broke through the silence. "We've arrived." Mike sat up, his eyes scanning the view. The vast emptiness of space stretched out before them, dotted with distant stars. But in the distance, there was a faint glow, something far brighter than any star Mike had ever seen. A planet, maybe. It was hard to tell. "Where are we?" Mike asked, his voice filled with awe. "This is our destination," Ilara replied, looking up from her console. "It's a remote place, far from the reach of our enemies. It's not on any known map, at least not one your people would recognize." Azar continued, his expression determined. "We have to make repairs here before we move on. We'll be safe for a while, but we need to fix the ship's core and get the other systems back online. This place is isolated enough that no one will find us quickly." Mike nodded, though the idea of fixing the ship in a place so unknown and remote made him nervous. But they didn't have much of a choice. The twins were counting on him. The ship slowly descended toward the surface of the planet, which was covered in thick clouds. The atmosphere looked thick, almost like the kind of place you'd expect to find in a sci-fi movie, perfect for hiding. A soft rumble echoed through the hull of the ship as the craft landed on solid ground, the landing gears making a faint sound as they touched down. "Here we are," Ilara said, her voice barely a whisper. We'll stay in the ship for now, until the repairs are finished. Mike stood up and stretched his legs, his muscles sore from sitting for so long. As he walked toward the exit, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that still lingered in the pit of his stomach. He might have helped them get this far, but there was still so much he didn't know. Azar followed him, opening a hatch in the wall of the ship. "Come on, Mike. Let's get to work." Outside the ship, the air was thick and humid. The planet's strange atmosphere felt heavier than Earth's. The ground beneath their feet was soft, almost spongy, like walking on thick moss. Mike looked around, but it was nearly impossible to see much of the landscape. The sky was covered in thick clouds, the sun obscured by the mist. Ilara led the way toward a makeshift repair bay that had been set up outside the ship. A collection of tools, alien equipment, and various parts were scattered around. Mike couldn't help but be amazed at how well prepared the twins were, even in the middle of nowhere. "We're going to need to get the core back online first," Azar said, pointing toward a glowing part of the ship that had gone dark. "We also need to repair the cloaking device. That was damaged during the last attack. I'll need your help with both." Mike nodded, walking toward the damaged area. It wasn't much different from working on a car, though the alien technology was definitely more complicated. He began to get to work, trying to focus on the task at hand. His mind raced with questions about everything he had learned since meeting the twins. Who were these enemies that were chasing them? What kind of world did they come from? And what was it they needed to do next? As Mike worked, his hands moving swiftly over the tools, Azar and Ilara stood nearby, talking in low voices about their next steps. Mike didn't hear much, but the serious look on their faces made it clear that their journey wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hours passed as Mike worked alongside Azar to fix the ship. There were moments of frustration when things didn't fit, or when the alien systems seemed more complex than expected. But Mike kept at it. Little by little, he began to understand the ship's inner workings better. It wasn't as different from working on Earth's machinery as he had first thought. A lot of it just came down to patience and paying attention to the details. Finally, after what seemed like forever, Mike wiped his brow and stood up. "It's done," he said, breathing a sigh of relief. The core's back online. The cloaking device should be working again too. Azar and Ilara both looked at the control panel. For a moment, there was silence as they checked the readings. Then Azar smiled, nodding in approval. "You've done it, Mike. The ship is working again. We can continue our journey." Mike smiled too, his exhaustion melting away as he realized that they could move forward. They weren't out of danger yet, but they were one step closer to their goal. As they made their way back into the ship, Mike felt a sense of accomplishment. He had helped the twins repair their ship, and he had learned more about alien technology than he could have ever imagined. But there was still so much more to do, and he knew that the journey was far from over. As the ship powered up, the engines humming back to life, Mike looked out the window, wondering what awaited them next. They had outrun their enemies, fixed the ship, and found a temporary safe haven. But Mike knew that they would always be running, always be hiding, until they figured out how to stop their enemies for good. For now, though, Mike was just glad to be part of the team. He had never expected any of this when he woke up that morning. But somehow, he had found himself in the middle of something bigger than himself, and he was ready for whatever came next. The ship's engines hummed steadily, a quiet reminder that they were ready to continue their journey. Mike looked out the small window of the cockpit, his eyes following the dark clouds that swirled outside. The planet they had landed on was strange, almost alien in its atmosphere, and Mike felt a sense of unease as he glanced around. Yet after all they had been through, he knew that they couldn't stay here forever. It was time to move on. Azar and Ilara had been busy since the repairs had been completed. They were finalizing the ship's systems, making sure everything was in perfect working order before they left the planet. Mike had helped as much as he could, but now that the big fixes were done, there wasn't much for him to do. The time had come for them to leave. Is everything ready to go? Mike asked, standing by the hatch, watching as Ilara adjusted some settings on the control panel. Almost, Ilara replied without looking up. Just some final calibrations. It's hard to know how long we can stay under the radar, but we'll need to keep moving soon. Our enemies are still out there, and they won't stop looking for us. Azar stepped into the room from the hallway, his face as serious as always. We've stayed here long enough. We need to get back into space and make sure we're not followed. Mike nodded, though part of him wished they could stay longer. The peacefulness of the planet had been a welcome break from the constant danger they had been running from. But he knew it couldn't last. As long as the enemy was after them, they would never have peace. "I'm ready," Mike said, his voice steady, though a small knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. The thought of leaving this strange world made him feel like he was jumping into the unknown all over again. He had no idea where they were going or what dangers awaited them. But if he had learned anything in the past few days, it was that he had no choice but to keep going. No turning back. Ilara finished her final adjustments, and with a soft click, the control panel lit up, signaling that the ship was ready for takeoff. "All right," Azar said, turning to Mike. "Let's get moving. Stay close. The journey ahead is going to be unpredictable." With a final look around the interior of the ship, Mike followed Azar and Ilara back toward the cockpit. He could feel the rumble of the engines starting up as they powered up for takeoff. The ship slowly lifted off the surface of the planet, the thick mist outside beginning to clear as they rose higher into the sky. Through the windows, Mike could see the vastness of space opening up before them. The endless void stretched out, dotted with stars, as they left the planet behind. "Where are we going?" Mike asked as they ascended, his curiosity getting the best of him. Azar looked over at him, his face softening slightly. "We're heading to a location where we can regroup, plan our next steps, and maybe even find some allies. It's a place that's hidden, even from the most advanced systems." Mike nodded, though he wasn't sure what allies meant in this context. He had only known Azar and Ilara for a short time, and everything about their world was still a mystery to him. He had learned a lot, but he had a long way to go. As the ship left the planet's atmosphere, a deep silence filled the cockpit. The steady hum of the engines was the only sound, but it was comforting now. Mike could feel the tension slowly leaving his body. They were safe for now, but the peace wouldn't last long. After a few minutes, Ilara spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "Mike, there's something we need to tell you." Mike turned to look at her, his eyebrows furrowing. "What's going on?" Azar and Ilara exchanged a glance, and Mike could tell that something serious was coming. His stomach twisted again, a feeling of dread settling in. "We've been thinking," Azar began, his voice serious but calm. "You've done so much for us already, more than we ever expected. You've helped us fix the ship, kept us safe from danger, and even worked alongside us when we were most vulnerable. You've proven that you're not just a mechanic. You're part of our team." Mike felt a wave of warmth and pride at Azar's words, but there was still a sense of uncertainty. "I just did what I could. I'm not sure I'm cut out for all this." He motioned to the vast, starry space outside. "I'm just a guy who fixes cars and trucks back on Earth. This whole alien stuff is way over my head." Ilara smiled, her eyes soft. "You've done more than you know, Mike. And because of that, we have something for you." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Something for me?" Azar nodded. "Yes, a gift. It's not much, but it's our way of saying thank you for everything you've done." Before Mike could say anything, Ilara stepped forward and handed him a small glowing device. It was about the size of a flashlight, with smooth alien markings etched into the sides. It glowed with a soft, blue light, almost as if it had a life of its own. "What is it?" Mike asked, holding the device carefully in his hands. "It's a communication device," Azar explained. "It will allow us to stay in contact with you no matter where you go. If you ever need us, just activate it, and we'll come for you. No matter the distance, no matter how far you go, we'll always be able to find you." Mike stared at the device in his hand, the weight of its significance sinking in. "You're giving this to me?" he asked, his voice a little choked. Ilara nodded. "You've proven that you're part of this journey, Mike. You've already helped us more than anyone else could. This device is a reminder that no matter what happens, we're here. And if you ever need us, we'll come for you." Mike swallowed hard, his emotions swirling inside him. He had never expected any of this. He was just a mechanic, a simple guy with a simple life. And now, here he was, standing in an alien ship, part of something far bigger than anything he had ever imagined, a part of something that mattered. "I don't know what to say," Mike whispered, his throat tight. "Thank you. This means a lot to me." Azar gave him a warm smile. "There's no need to thank us. You've earned it." For a moment, Mike just held the device in his hands, his mind racing with thoughts of what had come before and what was still to come. He had no idea how long this journey would last, or where it would lead, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly a part of something important. Something that mattered. Ilara placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile kind. "You don't have to be a hero, Mike. You just have to do what you're good at, and you've proven you're good at more than you realize." Azar's voice broke through the quiet again. "It's time to go. We've got a long way ahead of us." Mike nodded, still holding the device in his hand. "I'm ready." They all turned toward the front of the ship, where the vastness of space awaited them. The unknown, the endless journey ahead. But no matter what happened, Mike knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore.